Well, Mr. President Manuel, thank you so much for that very warm, overly generous introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. There's no pressure at all in following President Bill Clinton to this podium. I don't feel any pressure at all. Let me reassure you. It is really wonderful to be in Madrid. I have never lived here, but I've come here often in my diplomatic career with Warren Christopher and Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice, and it's such a beautiful city. Manuel and I just took our only time outside today was to take a walk in this lovely neighborhood, and I couldn't be happier to be here. And I'm very grateful to the Rafael del Pino Foundation for what we've done today. We've had a fascinating day. We've talked to a lot of journalists about what's happening here in Europe. I've had a lot of questions about a guy named Donald Trump and what he represents and what he is about to do to us and to the world, and we'll talk about that this evening. I've been with Manuel all day. He passed his exam with flying colors, by the way. Went on to get his PhD at Oxford, now teaching and a fellow at Harvard, and soon to come back to Madrid to be a teacher, a professor here, and to be part of the foundation. And we hope to have a big cooperation between the Rafael del Pino Foundation and Harvard University. We're looking forward to that as we try to build up our capacity to understand Europe and to follow European affairs at our university at a really critical time in the transatlantic relationship. There's another friend here, Ana Palacio, the former foreign minister of Spain, who is such a good friend of the United States. And I know that if two people were here, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, they would sing her praises. As someone who was not just a good friend of the United States at some very difficult times in the transatlantic relationship, but who never hesitated to disagree and give us advice when we were wrong, and the Americans are sometimes wrong. And so I want to thank Ana for being here and for being a great friend and someone I admire very much. So all of you are about to be subjected to one of my great failings in life. I do not speak Spanish. It's a major gap in my education. I understand that. I have told my 3 daughters, and I'm going to tell my granddaughter, who's 3.5, in the United States these days, you really should speak Spanish. We have one official language. I think that's probably a good thing to unify the country, but Spanish is so important, and increasingly so, and increasingly in the world, if you think about the power of Latin America and of your own country. So apologies to all of you that I can't converse with you in your native language. You're going to have to listen to me with my American accent. But I wanted to talk about a difficult subject. And Manuel and I thought, what should I talk about? I think it's the crisis of the West. And that involves all the challenges facing the European Union these days. It involves this extraordinary transformation that's been underway in the United States, I guess, since the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, the gradual turning inward of a lot of Americans, the loss of jobs in the United States, the rise of populism. I never thought we'd see that in the United States, but we're seeing it today. And now this new president, Donald Trump, who won this brilliant victory. He really did run a brilliant race. I was on the other side of that campaign. I supported Secretary Clinton. I worked for her for 18 months. I was bitterly disappointed at the results of our election. But I must say, Donald Trump found something in the American psyche, at least among many Americans, that was a winning formula for him. And this phrase is really quite remarkable. Make America Great Again spoke to a lot of Americans. And if you think, we were talking earlier today, he took on as this real estate developer from New York who'd never been in national politics. He took on 16 better known and better financed Republican candidates, and he defeated them one by one, including the Bush dynasty. And then he took on, certainly at one point, the most admired woman in our society when she left as Secretary of State in early 2013, a person who I think everyone would agree had every qualification to be president and defeated her in a national election. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. We've rarely seen anything like it in the history of American presidential elections. And so I think for all of us, people who support him or don't support him, I think the watchword is don't underestimate him. because he's been very effective on the highest stage in our society. But I want to start with another subject. We'll get to Donald Trump. I think that Spaniards, Europeans, Americans are facing in 2017 one of the most complex foreign policy agendas that we've ever faced. And I can't speak for you and your history and how you would place this time in the context of other times of challenge, Spain's return to democracy, your civil war. I mean, you've had a tumultuous last 100 years. I think for Americans, we'd have to go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's last term, 1944 into 1945. He died April 12th, 1945, just before the war ended here in Europe. You'd have to go that far back to find a time when Americans were so challenged. And I think if you look into the inbox of either the Spanish government or our government or what Angela Merkel's dealing with, or Xi Jinping or Narendra Modi in Delhi, or the Brazilian leadership, I mean, look at the challenges we face. We have climate change. We have the imperative of organizing 195 nation states to battle a challenge that affects 7.5 billion people on Earth. And we've just taken baby steps to get from the Rio Earth Summit of 1992 to Copenhagen in 2009 to Paris in December 2015. That first agreement that barely begins to mitigate the problem, barely gets the United States and China and India, the big carbon emitters, to begin to cut back at some point in the future, especially in the case of the Chinese. And that's a transnational problem that affects everybody on Earth. And there's so many other issues like that that require not just regional cooperation between the United States and Europe, but global cooperation. Trafficking of women and children, which is a scourge on every continent, we all know that. Organized drug cartels and crime cartels, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, the emergence of cyber espionage, the possibility of cyber warfare, that the next, God forbid, we have a global war ever again in the nuclear age or in the cyber age, but it could begin in cyberspace. Or cybercrime, organized networks designed to steal our personal information, our banking information, our health information from our iPhones and our laptops for criminal gain. And think about pandemics and the possibility of world food shortages. We've reached a point in human history where we've really got to organize on a global scale on these transnational problems to be effective, to serve the public, to head off problems, to mitigate and lessen the severity of major problems, and to achieve human progress. And that means that we've had to bring Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership into the ruling circle of the world over the last 10 or 15 years. The Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the South Africans, the Nigerians, the Turks, the Saudis have joined the antique powers of the G7, the European powers, Canada, the United States, Japan. And we've had to broaden that leadership circle into the G20. It's meeting today, the foreign ministers in Germany, because they've got to have this global consensus about how we approach the problems of the world. This is a forbidding time. Also forbidding when you think about the fact that the nuclear genie has been unleashed. When a 31-year-old with no prior employment or management experience owns a set of nuclear weapons in Pyongyang in North Korea, and none of our leaders have ever met him, and none of our leaders can truly determine whether he's rational or not, as he fires off ballistic missiles and conducts nuclear tests and threatens South Korea and Japan. And experts say within 5 to 10 years, may have a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead on top that could hit San Francisco and Sacramento and Los Angeles and San Diego and Nevada and Arizona, which as an American is unacceptable, that this country that has caused so many problems of the world could hold my country in nuclear blackmail. And then think about biological and chemical genies that have been unleashed. We're at a time of human history where our global leadership has to be on the same sheet of music. They have to be working with each other, as Ana did when she was foreign minister of Spain, traveling constantly around the world to try to make a dent, some progress in these global issues. I'm not saying it's the most dangerous moment that Spaniards and Americans have lived. You went through your Civil War. We went through our Civil War. Both more difficult moments for both of our societies. But the sheer number of global problems that require us to be intelligent and to have foresight and to be able to organize each other and to be able to work across cultural and ideological boundaries, Chinese and Americans, Russians and Germans, South Africans and Nigerians. This is a difficult leadership job, not just for the present set of leaders, but I teach at a university for the young kids who are going to inherit this world from us in just a few years. So I want to start there. I think this is a hard time to be a global leader. It's a hard time to be a diplomat from Spain or the United States, but it's an important time. In fact, we've rarely seen such important time to get these issues right. The two parts of the world that have generally been the organizers of these efforts are Europe and North America. Because of our economic power over the last 100 to 150 years, because of the military power that we had certainly from the Second World War to the end of the Cold War, because of the lead that we had in technology up until the recent past, because China under Deng Xiaoping had to really focus on China itself, building the country and lifting people out of poverty and regaining Macau and Hong Kong. And India has to deal with 600 million people living below the global poverty line. It's been the Americans and Europeans who since 1945 have been the drivers of the agenda, the organizers of the conferences, the countries pushing international cooperation. I would credit Europe with being the global leader on climate change. As an American diplomat, and I remember when we were in the climate denial business, I remember that when the George W. Bush administration initially said we're not going to join Kyoto, and being an American diplomat in Greece at the time, and how difficult that was for Europeans who thought climate change was right up there at the top of their list to have the, at that point, greatest carbon emitter say, we're not interested in working with you. And I always thought the European Union was the conscience, kind of ringing the village bell, asking countries to sacrifice and organize and do something about climate change. So Americans and Europeans have a very important place now and will in the future. The European Union is the largest global economy. The United States, the largest aggregate global power, military, political, economic combined. We're going to have the foresight to recognize the major problems and then to help drive the world towards solutions. But I think we're in crisis. I think Europe is facing maybe the most difficult set of challenges you've faced since you began organizing the European coal and steel community just after the Second World War. I know we are in almost an existential crisis. We're having debates now about what kind of world power we should be, about whether even we should be a world power, as our president turns conventional wisdom upside down in Washington. And I wanted to say a word about both Europe and the United States, and then I promise I'm going to try to end with hope, because I don't want to thoroughly depress you at this gathering. And then we'll be happy to take your questions and listen to your ideas. A word about Europe. I served a lot of my career in Europe. I was a high school exchange student in Luxembourg. I was a university exchange student in France. I was an ambassador to Greece, ambassador to NATO. I lived a lot of my adult life in Europe. I know how far Europe has come from the ashes of the Second World War, when most of the major economies of this continent were destroyed. 60 million dead worldwide, the majority of them on this continent. The United States with 50% of global GDP in 1950 because Europe was so shattered. And then the remarkable recovery of all of the economies of this continent, and the emergence of countries from authoritarian past, like Germany and Spain, into fully democratic nations. I've always considered what's happened in Europe to be almost a miracle. to go from the populism of the 1930s to the disintegration of the Second World War, the catastrophe of the Second World War, to all the challenges in the post-war era, to the glories of the European Union. 500 million people, center of justice in the world, the extraordinary standard of living, the social values that have unified Europeans, and now to see that under siege in 2017 by the rise of right-wing populism. Geert Wilders, the most popular rated politician in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen, who unfortunately was consulting at Trump Tower a couple of weeks ago with associates of Donald Trump, a serious candidate to get to the second round of the French presidential elections in April and May. Alternative for Deutschland, the number 3 party in Germany, rising fast. The government of Viktor Orban, which I'd have to put in that group of populist parties, and Golden Dawn, the 3rd ranking political party. It's a fascist party in Greece. Has Europe experienced anything like this since the 1920s and 1930s? And these 3 consequential elections that you shall have in the Netherlands, France, and Germany, 3 of your most important economies and countries in 2017, this is going to be a consequential year that determines the fate and at least the momentum behind the ever closer union of the European Union. And to see this phenomenon of right-wing populism coincide with the Putin challenge in Eastern Europe, the challenge of Putin carving countries up to the south and west of the Russian Federation, particularly his illegal annexation of Crimea, his division of Ukraine, his harassment of the Baltic states, his division of Georgia almost 8.5 years ago. The populist challenge, the Putin challenge, the migrant challenge, which from an outsider's perspective, you've seen 2 Europes. The West Europeans largely trying to accommodate this extraordinary exodus of people out of Syria and Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan. The East Europeans largely closing the doors, especially to Muslim refugees. To see that phenomenon divide the European Union itself and to challenge the ability of Brussels to form a cohesive policy on a great social, political, and economic challenge. And then on top of that, Brexit, your 2nd largest economy, your largest military, arguably the most globally oriented European country saying, we are leaving. Article 50, clock starts next month, 2 years and 1 month from today. Britain will probably be out, seeking new relationships in the world. It's going to have a major impact on the health and future of the European Union. And as I still focus a lot on Greece, to read in the FT this morning that another Greek debt crisis is coming this summer, and another Greek government, the same Greek government, defying the European Central Bank, the European Union, and the IMF. These are an extraordinary set of problems, and I haven't even talked about the fact that the European project appears to be weakening. Marine Le Pen says, take France out of the Eurozone. The right-wing populists don't want an ever closer union. Publics, much like in my country where in the States people want Washington to give back power to the state capitals, a lot of people in Europe want their national governments to take back some of the power that was devolved to Brussels over the last 30 and 40 years. I think as an outsider, and you will know more about your reality than I do, but as an outsider looking at you, I can't remember a time in my lifetime when Europe was so challenged. And I want to say today, the United States of America has always supported the European Union, and I hope we always will. I don't want to be unfair or disrespectful to our president, but when he told the Times of London 2 weeks ago, Monday, that it really didn't matter to him whether or not the European Union succeeded or failed, that was a thunderbolt of a statement, and it was misguided. Because from Harry Truman on, every American president has always thought that the way to resolve the problem between France and Germany that caused the three wars between 1871 and 1945, the three catastrophic European wars, was to bring them together, and you and all the other Europeans, in one virtuous union, and you built it. When I started teaching at Harvard 8 years ago, when I left the State Department, I used to tell my students, the greatest story of our time, there are two great stories, the information and technological revolution that we all know, and the European Union are the two great stories of the second half of the 20th century. It is a glorious, democratic, peaceful, virtuous union. And I really hope that Donald Trump is going to bring himself to say and mean that we support the European Union and the European project. Why would we support populism? Why would we support forces who want to take countries out of the European Union, as Donald Trump did the morning after the Brexit vote? If you look at the public opinion polls, if you survey members of Congress, if you ask anyone who's ever held the offices that Anna has held, Secretary of State in our country, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, not a single one of them, in my judgment, in the Republican and Democratic Party would say that we should not support the European Union. So I hope Europeans feel that we're with you. But we're arrived at a time when it's not clear whether we are with you. When the first visitor to Trump Tower after the election on November 8th was Nigel Farage, when the president-elect tweeted out to the British government, why don't you appoint him to be ambassador to the United States, when Marine Le Pen did make it to Trump Tower. When we know that in the White House today there's a battle for the future of the administration, and one faction is ultra-nationalist and seems to think it's a good thing for countries to leave the European Union. I think it's a disaster for countries to leave the European Union. Because I think the EU is the guarantor of stability in Europe, economic and political stability and peace in Europe. When Germany was unified, we all remember that. When the Cold War ended, Mitterrand and Kohl and Thatcher and our president, our great president, George H.W. Bush they said Europe was whole, free, and at peace. Everything Europe had not been for hundreds of years. So I just wanted to come here tonight to say, we believe in you. We believe in the European project. We want you to succeed. But I do think that Europe is in crisis. And I think the United States is in crisis. How can we not be in crisis? When as the leading economic, military, and political power in the world, we're now having a national debate about whether NATO is obsolete or worth continuing. I always felt as a diplomat, and I work for both parties as all of my brethren in the Foreign Service do, and we're apolitical, that the great power advantage that we had over the Russians and Chinese is that we had allies in the world, and they didn't. And it's a very meaningful thing to have allies. From a purely self-interested point of view, it expands your power base. It makes you stronger. But I found out on 9/11 just how important the NATO alliance was to the United States. I was a very new, 11, 12-day-old new American ambassador to NATO on 9/11, watching from Brussels as the Twin Towers crashed and burned and Pentagon was attacked and 3,000 people died, trying to communicate with Washington. But the White House and the State Department had been evacuated. And the Canadian ambassador called me. He was the dean of our diplomatic corps at NATO, the longest serving ambassador, David Wright. And he said, have you thought about invoking Article 5? And you all, I think, know what Article 5 is of our treaty. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. The great historical irony is that it was the Europeans who came to Harry Truman at the very end of the negotiations in March 1949 to say, we don't think, if we form this collective defense institution with you, that you'll actually come a third time, you and the Canadians, across the Atlantic. If Stalin attacks, as the West Europeans feared that he might attack, 1949, 1950, whatever. And so at the very last moment in these negotiations, we agreed to Article 5, that we would come over, and the presumption always would be that the North Americans would come back. That would be the scenario. And the huge historical irony is that the only time we've ever invoked Article 5 was the next morning, September 12, 2001. And it was the Europeans coming to the defense of the Americans. It was the Europeans even saying to me at NATO headquarters that night, I was asked a question, who attacked you? The evening of September 11th. And President Bush had not yet declared it was Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. That would come later. I said, we haven't said who it, we have suspicions. And they still invoked Article 5, and they said, we will go to war with you. And every NATO country went into Afghanistan, and every NATO country is still there. So when I hear Americans say, what value are these alliances? Have they paid their dues? Why is Spain not at 2% of GDP? Well, I wish Spain was. But I tell that story about 9/11, how in our time of greatest need, you came to our defense. That's the value of allies. And I called Anna's good friend Condi Rice the morning of the 12th to say, the Allies want to go to war with us. I need to get the president's permission. And she said, go for it. The president was asleep. It was 4 in the morning. But she said to me, it's really good to have allies in the world. And that's why Americans need to be devoted to Europe and Canada, because we need you, and I think you need us in a dangerous world. And what bothers me now is that the new administration, at least in the campaign in the early days, the new president has been saying, do we really need these alliances? Japan, South Korea, and Australia, NATO. And the answer is yes. It's the foundation of our power. Do we need to trade in the world? We're now questioning NAFTA, which I think has been one of the great success stories in American history. Our virtuous North American Union with Mexico and Canada. Questioning the US-EU trade agreement. Rejecting the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is not 1817, where you can be an autarkic economy, or where the United States could live in splendid isolation because the Atlantic and Pacific would protect us. It's 2017. We live in a global economy. We're succeeding in the global economy. But if you begin to raise barriers and reject free trade, and especially reject multilateral trade, China's going to write the trade rules in Asia, and they will not write them in a way that you or I would agree with them, because they won't respect intellectual property rights, and there'll be major advantages for the Chinese government against the smaller Asian economies. We've always been a trading nation. Since the earliest days in the 1780s of our republic, and we can't deny that we are a trading nation. But trade is under question, as alliances are under question. And the third thing that is under question, and for me this is existential, and it's existential for every American, is do we keep our doors open? Do we continue the immigrant tradition in American society? Every American, I don't know how many Americans are here tonight. Okay, there are quite a number of Americans, quite a few. Every one of us has an immigrant story that probably doesn't go back more than 2 or 3 generations. We all come from someplace else. In my case, 2 Irish grandparents. But everybody's got a story. And so now we're at a time when our president and others are saying, shut down the borders. Significantly curtail immigration. President Obama wanted to take in 110,000 Americans. He wanted his successor to as immigrants in 2017. President Trump's proposal is 50,000. We've always taken in refugees. President Trump's proposal is we will take in no Syrian refugees, and we won't take refugees from 7 Muslim countries. It's a ban on Muslims. But we will take Christian minorities, but not Muslims. This is antithetical to our multiracial, multi-ethnic melting pot of a society. That's who we are. That's what the Statue of Liberty in Donald Trump's New York Harbor represents. It was all about immigration and refugees. My friend David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, now runs our largest American refugee organization in New York City. And David reminded me a couple of months ago, he said in every refugee crisis since World War II, the United States has taken half of the refugees of any particular crisis. The process is the United Nations issues an appeal. we have X number, 200,000, 50,000 refugees that need to be resettled from the Central African Republic, or Congo, or Lebanon, or Cyprus, or Syria. And the United States has generally taken half. So what's happened with the 5 million Syrian refugees beyond Syrian borders, and there's 7 million internally displaced, homeless, and 5 million beyond their borders? The United States has taken 12,500 Syrian refugees. As you have struggled to accommodate well over 1 million Syrian refugees, mainly in Western and Northern Europe, we are not helping the European Union. For the first time since 1945. For the first time in the life of any of us who've been practicing diplomats or public officials. And I think we begin to deny the very nature of the state that we are. An open state, not a fearful state. And we have this extraordinary debate in the United States right now. And there's a lot of alternative facts and misinformation being put forward by the president and by his supporters. And the facts are that of all the Syrian refugees that we have taken in, not a single one has been engaged in a terrorist attack. Of the 800,000 refugees we've taken in since 9/11 from all over the world, we've had very few, as in single-digit, problems of even people becoming criminals. People don't come to the United States because they want to become lawless. They want to come to become citizens, to escape some horrible reality, some war, some famine. We find that our refugees are our best citizens, and sometimes the most patriotic citizens because they choose to be citizens. They're not just born as citizens. So this is a remarkable debate. When you begin to debate, should we have allies? Should we trade? And should we close down the borders of the country to the least fortunate, to the people who really need us? I think it's shameful, the debate we're having now. And it's almost as if I don't recognize the country that we live in. I told Manuel earlier today, in our election we had Bernie Sanders run from the left to say America's failing. And we had Donald Trump run from the right and say America's failing. And there stood Hillary Clinton saying, we're at 4.7% unemployment. We've got very low inflation. We're the dominant global economy. If you look at our strengths, biotechnology, nanotechnology, the digital age that's coming, artificial intelligence, California, Austin, Texas, Research Triangle, North Carolina, I don't want to sound arrogant. Where I live, Boston, these are among the leading tech centers of the world. We're going to be strong 50 years from now. We're not failing. And yet if that's the political rhetoric from left and right, it's hard for a responsible person standing in the middle, like Hillary Clinton, to withstand that ideological onslaught. We're not failing. Europe is not failing. We're living in virtuous times. Lots of problems, but lots of advantages, lots of growth. And I think that's what's important for Europeans and Americans to get back. And I'll finish on this note. What we've built since May 8th, 1945, the end of the war in Europe, has been the greatest liberal world order in human history. It's a world order that we Europeans, Americans, and Canadians believe is based on human freedom, human dignity, democratic governments, the rule of the people, a free press, the movement of peoples, Schengen, the American borders, accepting peoples of all colors and all faiths. It's the greatest invention in global history. We, I think, Europeans and North Americans, we don't want to live in Russia's authoritarian state. We don't want to live in China's anti-religious, anti-human rights state. We want to live in free societies. And it's that liberal world order, it's so precious and it's so fragile. If you contest the judiciary and say the judiciary should have diminished rights, or if you demean the free press, which is the guardian of democracy, then you begin to chip away at this very fragile edifice that Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, those great Europeans, and Harry Truman and Marshall and Acheson built. And our whole careers, certainly Anna's and mine, because Manuel's just getting started, we just tried to perfect that liberal world order. And we shouldn't allow it to be tossed away by right-wing populists on both sides of the Atlantic. And I just have this faith that Europe's going to get through these elections. I have faith in the Germans, that they're not going to hear this call to populism. I have faith in my own country. I have faith in the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I have faith in our court system. I have faith in our Republican senators who are standing up to say that we should not be best friends with Vladimir Putin. I have faith that we're going to get through this, but it is a trying time. So it's a time for transatlantic unity, and one of the things that we've been talking to the Rafael del Pino Foundation today is that the foundation and Harvard should be working together, that we should return the study of Europe to the center of the American academy. What's happened in our universities is the research money on Europe has all gone away because Europe was perfect in the 1980s and 90s into this century. And now we study China, and this is good, and India, and Latin America, other parts of the world. We're trying to rebuild a transatlantic center at Harvard. We're trying to rebuild we have no one teaching at the Kennedy School in Europe right now, not a single tenured professor. So we've been talking today, how do we work on both sides of the Atlantic to deepen the understanding of what Europe is going through in the United States? And I think you might need American centers at your universities as we work through these problems. I'm actually hopeful about the future. I think our two parts of the world are actually successful if we resist these siren calls from both left and right. Thank you very much.